We're going to review year-end processing and closing procedures for Sage 100. A few housekeeping notes before we get started. We've got a pretty full house, so I'm going to place everyone on mute. As questions come up, please type them into the questions panel on your console, should be to the right of your screen, and we'll go through all the questions at the end of the presentation. There is also a handouts panel on that console where the tips to follow along with the modules is attached in case you need that. And as a reminder, we will be providing a recording of this webinar and the handout again later in this week. So now I will pass it over to Ryan Whipple, our presenter. Ryan?
Thanks, Leanne. Thank you, everybody, for coming out today. So we're going to go ahead and go through basically the year-end procedures, the common steps that you should do for closing each of your modules. So we're going to be going through that first. Then at the end, we're going to go through in detail how you print your W-2s and your 1099s through the federal and state e-filing or the Atrix software. So to start off with the closing procedures, the first thing you want to do at the end of the year is make sure that you have a good backup of your company. So first of all, that obviously means that you want to have your nightly backup, make sure that that is running smoothly. It's a good time to check that backup, make sure that it's really working correctly, because we've had plenty of clients who thought that it was working correctly until their system crashed and they needed to do a restore, and then they found out the tape was corrupt or the hard drive was corrupt, whatever it may be. So good time to work with your IT and make sure that that's working. It's also what a lot of clients decide to do is make a backup or another copy of the company inside of the Sage 100 software. So we're going to take a look at how you do that. That is done through the Library Master module in the main folder and inside of Company Maintenance. So in here, when you're copying a company, you would either go into an existing company that you're going to copy over the top of, or if it's a situation like this with year-end where a lot of times you want to keep that backup or that copy long-term, you would make a new company to copy into. So I'm going to create a new company here. I'm going to call it P15, and I'm just going to give it a name. So then once you have a name in there, you can click the copy button over on the far right side. It's going to give you a warning telling you that if any modules are integrated together, that if you don't copy all of the modules, then obviously the data might not match between the two. So you want to make sure you copy everything. Now for purposes of year-end backup, I have a lot of clients that like to have a full copy of their entire company. But you know, due to data size and server limitations, sometimes that won't work for everybody. So like if you have payroll, you might be backing up just payroll, different things like that. It's also going to give us a message saying that we have to save the company before that we can make the copy. So we're just going to tell that yes to save. And then this window pops up where it asks us what company we want to copy from. So I'm going to tell it Y15. That's the company that we'll be working with today. And when we do that, it populates a list down below of all of the modules that are in that Y15 company. And now it defaults to selecting all of the modules. If it's a situation where you don't want to copy everything, you could unselect with this button on the right. That'll deselect everything. And you could pick just the company or the module that you're interested in. So let's say, for example, payroll. So once you have that selected, and it's important up here to pay attention and make sure that your source company is where you're copying from and your destination is what you're copying into. So once you have that verified, then at the bottom you would hit proceed. It's going to give you one last chance to make sure that you have, or that you've selected everything and you're really sure you want to do this, and then you tell it yes. Now when you're copying a company, especially for a year-end backup, and you want to make sure that that data integrity is there and everything is correct, you want to have all of your users out of that company that you're copying from, or do it, at night or early in the morning when people aren't in the software. So we'll go ahead and hit accept here because now we have our year-end backup, and we can use that year-end backup later on down the road to print our W-2s out of, or different things like that, or just to refer back to and run reports as of the end of the year. So when you go to close the modules, there is an order that they should be closed in, and the logic behind that is that different modules have data that flow through or affect each other. So for example, the sales order module, it uses inventory, it increase and decreases your quantities in inventory. So before you close the inventory module, you should be sure to have your sales order module closed because sales order affects inventory. And that order that they should be performed in is first purchase order, then sales order, then inventory, MRP, time card, payroll, AR, then AP, job cost, and then finally GL. Now in general, the rule of thumb I like to use is basically you start at the bottom of the list of modules and work your way up. It may not be that exact same order that I listed, but it basically is the same effect. So if you just start at the bottom and work your way up, you'll finish at general ledger. So for purchase order, there are a few things that you want to make sure that you do at the end of the month. The first one, and an important one that occasionally gets lost when there's employee turnover and things like that, is printing your purchases clearing report and actually reconciling that and making sure that it is balancing to your GL. So that purchases clearing report, it is always data as of today, or live data. So you need to be sure that you run that right at the end of the month before transactions are processed for the new month. So that's done in PO period end in the purchases clearing report. So if you come in there and then you hit preview or print, obviously, this report will list for you all of your items that have been received on a purchase order, but you haven't then invoiced those items, or you haven't received the invoice from the vendor yet. So this is the report total here, gives you the amount that should balance with your purchases clearing GL account from your GL trial balance. So make sure that you reconcile that. It's definitely easier if you stay on top of it 1 month or each month. Then it's usually really easy to find any discrepancies. If you let it go for 6 months, a year, it can become a really big project to try to get that back into balance. The other thing that is good to do is to review your open purchase order report. So this isn't something that's, specifically related to the end of the month. It's just something that should be done periodically. So the end of the month is a good enough time to go ahead and review that. So depending on how far out or what the lead times are with your vendors, different companies might have purchase orders sit open for different amounts of time. But look at your company and you'll get a feel for how long things should be out there for. But if you have really old purchase orders out there, you'll want to research those purchase orders, find out why they're still out there. And basically, I get this question a lot. I have these really old POs, but they're still sitting out here. I don't know why they're still showing up here. They should be done. So any purchase order is going to show up here as still open if you have the quantity received, and if the quantity received is if the quantity back ordered is not 0 and the quantity received doesn't match the quantity invoiced, then that purchase order is still going to show up here. And the last thing that it's a good thing to do at the end of the month is to review your prepaid purchases and your vendor deposits. Make sure that all of those have been reconciled properly. The next module is the sales order module. In sales order, same thing. It's a good time to review your open sales order report. Make sure that you don't have anything sitting out there that's really old that doesn't belong. And you'll also want to, again, reconcile your customer deposits account. Make sure that all of that has been handled correctly. In inventory, the end of the year, that's a time a lot of companies like to do their physical counts. So it's a good time for you to go through and do your physical counts. And when you're performing your physical counts, you'll want to make sure that all of your sales order invoices and your purchase order receipts have been updated to reflect the most current warehouse activity before you go out and actually count the items. If you don't do that, then you may end up double counting or missing some items, and it's just going to, even though you just did a physical count, you're still going to be left with incorrect quantities on hand. If you're using LIFO, FIFO, lot, or serial as your valuation, you'll want to make sure that you print the negative tier report and run the negative tier adjustment register. So Sage, it gives you the ability to sell inventory items even if you don't have those items or the quantity on hand for those items, because it knows you may have them on order and you just need to get the invoice out, that sort of thing. So for a LIFO, FIFO, those kind of valuations, it actually creates a negative tier, or basically a negative quantity in the costing tiers. And then it uses the standard cost or the last cost for that item for those tiers. So the negative tier report, that will give you a list of all of those items that were over distributed. So you can go through that, make sure that it looks correct, make sure that you didn't have an item where they just picked the wrong item and it doesn't belong on there at all. Obviously in that situation you'd reverse that sale and then reissue it with the correct inventory item. But once you've looked that over and it seems like it's all correct, there's no mistakes on there, then you run your inventory negative tier adjustment. And this is a step that some people miss. They just run the report and think that they're done. But the negative tier adjustment is what actually makes changes. So the negative tier adjustment will go out and find those negative costing tiers, and it will look to see if there have been any positive costing tiers, or basically a receipt of goods that's been done against a purchase order at a later date, and then it'll basically offset or apply those negative and positive quantities together. And then if there's any difference in what the unit cost was when it estimated and did the over distribution versus when the PO actually came in, then it would make an adjustment to your general ledger to account for that difference. So make sure you run this at the end of the month. That will take care of those. You'll also want to make sure that you print your inventory trial balance report. And that is the report that is designed to balance with your general ledger. So it takes into account the date that things were actually posted to the GL, not just the date of the invoice or the date of the receipt. So it actually balances with the GL and matches up with those transaction dates. We have also the inventory valuation report and the inventory stock status report. that you would normally print at the end of the month or print them to paperless office or to a PDF, something like that, so you have a record of those. So next we'll just talk about some of the end of quarter or end of year steps that you'd run in payroll, and then later on we'll delve deeper into printing W-2s and that kind of stuff. So payroll, it only allows maintenance for 1 year at a time. So when you do your end of year in payroll, it actually clears out all of your payroll numbers for the prior year. It purges any terminated employees, so those won't show up in employee maintenance anymore, which is one of the major reasons that you want to have that year-end backup before you go and close the year in your payroll. It's also important to point out that the tax tables in payroll, those are system-wide. So once you install the new tax tables for 2016, even if you go into that year-end backup company, it's still going to be using those 2016 tax tables. So if you had to go in and do any kind of adjusting or reversing payroll entries in that backup company, you would need to reinstall your 2015 tax tables before you made those kind of changes. Also, as part of the tax tables, you have your FICA limit. Let me show you that. So in Setup, Tax Table Maintenance. So in here you can select any of the states, or you can type in FED to bring up your federal tax tables. So this FICA, employee and employer FICA limit here, this number affects how your W-2s print, how your 941s print, and that kind of stuff. So in general, when you install the new tax tables, it would put in the new FICA limit. So before you would run anything for the prior year, you would need to change that FICA limit back to what it was for the prior year. Now this year it's a special situation. It looks like the FICA limit in 2016 is going to remain the same as it is now in 2015. So this year is that special situation where you won't have to go in and switch it back and forth. But in general, you want to remember that as a step that you would want to be making that change because, yeah, it's very rare that that limit doesn't change each year. You'll also want to remember that you don't want to install those 2016 tax tables until you are sure that you're finished with all of your 2015 payroll. It happens pretty much every year. We have a client that goes in and gets those installed, and then maybe they forgot about year-end bonus checks or things like that, and then they have to go through the process of reinstalling the 2015 tax tables, process those checks, and then reinstall the 2016. Or sometimes they don't do that step, and then that can affect how the taxes look on those bonus checks and, mess things up. And then you also obviously want to make sure that you don't close the payroll or do year-end until you've printed your W-2s. So if you're not planning on making a year-end backup company, you're just going to process them out of your live company and then close after you're done. Be sure that you've made that backup first. So again, if you're needing to process 2016 payrolls before you can do before you can print your 2015 W-2s, you'll want to make that copy of the company that we looked at the start of today. Then you can perform period end processing in your live company. You'll never do period end in that backup company because that's a snapshot and that's just going to be left alone. Then you can install the 2016 tax tables, process your 2016 payroll, and then in a normal year you would change the FICA limit back and process any prior year stuff when you're ready, and then you would change it back to the new limit when you're done with that and you're ready to process more payroll. As part of your setups in payroll, there is an option for perpetual history. This option here under the main tab, retain perpetual payroll history. You want to make sure that you have that turned on. And for all of you that have payroll, I imagine that you probably have it turned on, but it may be a good thing to double check. Sage uses that perpetual payroll history for some of the ACA reporting that it does, because some of that reporting has to look across years, so it really needs that information to calculate that. So make sure you have that turned on. Plus, it's just a valuable resource for writing custom reports or using the standard reports and looking back at prior years or across years. As part of year end, there's quite a few reports that you should run. Make sure that you print your quarterly tax report, your payroll check history report, the quarterly pay period recap, your earnings report, the deduction report, benefit accrual report, your workers' comp report, your quarterly governmental, your 941s, and lastly your W-2s. And you'll want to reconcile your quarter-to-date and year-to-date totals on all of those reports and make sure that they're all balancing and that everything looks correct. You'll also want to run your employee totals verification from the period end. This report goes through and compares the check total history with the summary numbers that are saved for the employee. And obviously, if there's any discrepancy between those, then there has most likely been some sort of problem, and you'll need to research that and do adjusting checks or manually make changes to fix the amounts. And then the last step would be doing the federal e-filing and reporting, and we'll be looking at that closer when we talk about W-2 printing. So the next one we'll look at is accounts receivable. So if your company charges finance charges, it may be a situation where you do those monthly or you do it just at the end of the year, but make sure that you have your finance charges entered. It's also a good time, obviously, to be printing your statements. In your setups for accounts receivable, year-end is always a good time to review how long you have data saved in your history, because when you do period end or year-end closing in any module, it actually purges out your oldest information based on how long you have it set to retain your history. So it's going through as part of that process and clearing out your oldest transactions. So it's good to check that before you do year-end, make sure that they're set correctly. A big one in AR is your days to retain paid invoices. And what this affects is what invoices are listed for you in customer maintenance or customer inquiry. So in customer maintenance, those invoices on there, once they are fully paid, they will only stay showing on that list for, in this case, 999 days after they were paid. And then after that, when you do a month-end processing, it will go and actually clear those off, and they will drop off of that list. They'll still exist in your invoice history. If you came out here and went to invoice history inquiry, you'd still see them. You'd still see them if you ran the accounts receivable invoice history report, but they wouldn't show up on that list still. So you'll want to make sure that you have that set correctly, because what happens a lot, especially after customers attend a webinar like this or something like this, they realize that they're far behind on closing their modules, so they go through and close a year, 2 years worth of months at a time, but they don't check this option first, and it might have been set for 30 days. So all of a sudden, they've been used to seeing a really long-term history in these in their customer maintenance, and all of a sudden, after they do all those month-end closing, that data is gone, and they're in a panic. So make sure you have this set. I obviously recommend 999 days. It gives you about 2.5 years worth of history. So it gives you basically the best option. And usually after that amount of time, it's not information that you would be looking at anyways. So it's okay that it's off in another area. And this is done because, you know, some clients, they may process thousands of invoices, so it becomes too much information to see them all there. So they have this option there to keep that list a little more maintainable. And then while we're at it, those invoices that are displayed in accounts receivable, and the same thing really applies for invoices in AP, you have a default way of displaying those invoices. I always recommend descending invoice date. It defaults by invoice number, which usually means that your oldest invoices are at the top. So every time you have to go in there, you have to scroll all the way to the bottom. So if you have it set to descending invoice date, then you're looking at the most recent invoices up at the top anyways, and when those oldest invoices drop off, you probably won't even notice, and it's probably not going to affect you at all. So in addition to this days to retain paid invoices here, we have a history tab where we have the number of years to retain cash receipt history, the number of years to retain customer history and salesperson history. So it's a good time to go through and review these. Some people have them set to 99 years. Some leave it at more the default of 2 years. It's kind of up to you and how much information you like to see. Okay, and again, as part of the month end, there's some reports that you should run. So you should run your accounts receivable trial balance report. This is the report that you would use to reconcile to the GL. A lot of people try to use the aged invoice report, but that report includes or excludes invoices just based off of their invoice date, where the AR trial balance report includes them based off of the date they were posted to the general ledger. So you may find if somebody dated an invoice in, let's say, November, but posted it to the GL in December, or vice versa, that it can cause your aged invoice report to not balance with the GL, where the trial balance report would handle that and only show you those transactions that were posted to the GL in that same time period that you're reconciling for. But it is good to still also print your aged invoice report. Keep a copy of that. Print your cash receipts report, your salesperson commission report, your monthly sales report, and your sales tax report. So the next module we'll talk about is accounts payable. AP is very similar to accounts receivable. It has a lot of the same considerations. So that number of days to retain invoices in accounts receivable, AP has basically the same option. So you'll want to go through the setups and compare those as well. I'll show you where those are. So it's on the additional tab over on the right, days to retain paid invoices. And again, in history, you have a number of years to retain purchase history and to retain your 1099 payment history. But obviously with accounts payable, the big thing is 1099s, and especially at year end, you'll want to be reconciling and making sure you have the correct information for your 1099s. And the best report to reconcile that with is under the reports folder, your payment history report. So with this report, you can tell the report to sort by your vendor number or vendor name. And then there's an option here to tell it to print only 1099 vendors. So what we find sometimes is that you might set up a vendor, start doing work and paying that vendor, but then you find out later that that vendor should have been a 1099 vendor. So because they weren't set up and marked that way for the first few invoices you ran for them, the amounts of those invoices and those payments aren't going to be included in your 1099 totals that the system is saving. But if you run this report, now that you've marked them as a 1099 vendor, the amounts that you see here will show you all of the payments that you have made to them, and then you can compare those amounts to the totals that are printing on your 1099s. So you can go through and do a test run of your 1099s and see the amounts, or you can also open up vendor maintenance from the accounts payable main folder. You can pull up your 1099 vendor, go to the additional tab, and you have a 1099 history button here. So this is where you can then confirm the amounts that are going to print on your 1099s. Okay? And obviously if there's any mistakes or you find they're not matching with the reports that you ran, then you can manually overwrite and change the amounts here, and this is where the 1099 printing will pull its totals from. So some other reports, again, you'll want to run the trial balance report in AP, accounts payable trial balance. Again, this is the report that should balance with the GL for the same reasons we've discussed. You'll also want to run your aged invoice report, your check history report, and your Form 1099. You would obviously want to print those 1099s. If you have the job cost module, for your closing, you'll want to make sure that all of your transactions have been updated. If your monthly overhead calculations are being used, you'll want to print and update the monthly overhead allocation report and the daily transaction register. You'll want to print the work in process report, and to PDF is fine for that. Then you'll want to perform your year-end processing from the menu, and then complete period-end processing after all the selected reports have been printed from the job cost period-end folder. Now for the general ledger, obviously you've closed all of the other modules, so you'll want to be sure that you've gone through and done period end in all of those modules first. Then again, there's history retention options here. So if we go to the setup folder in general ledger options, you want to verify the number of years to retain your general ledger history. Obviously, you don't have to set it at 99. A lot of clients do like 7 or 10 years. Really, it just depends on how far back you think you'll want to be able to go and run financial reports or GL detail reports, that kind of stuff. Also in the setups, if you use budgets in In the general ledger, you'll want to verify which budget is your default, and then you'll want to check this setup option down here, copy actual to default budget at year end. So if you have that turned on, when you close the 2015 year, it's going to copy the 2015 actual information over the top of the 2016 original budget, which a lot of people might like that option. Gives them a good starting place to go for working with their budgets. But if you've already started working on your budget and you're halfway through entering that budget for 2016, this would then copy and wipe out all of your work. So you'll want to be sure that that one is taken care of. In the Entry tab, you'll want to check this setting here for your source journals. So you have the option for your journal entry numbers to have them reset, or the next journal entry number to reset when you do year end. So you could be at the end of each period or the end of year. It's basically designed for companies that process, 1,000 journal entries a day. They quickly run out of space and, run out of numbers, and they need to reset and start over periodically. Obviously, 99% of our clients, that situation doesn't apply to them. So we usually recommend that it's set to never reset because it can get confusing and make it more difficult to research postings if you have 3 different journal entry number 1s out there. So make sure that that's set to never reset if that situation doesn't apply to you. It's also important to point out, make sure that you're actually running your year-end processing. We get a lot of people that just get in the habit of leaving the modules open indefinitely. It can happen especially with the general ledger because you might be waiting for year-end journal entries or adjustments from your CPA, and so you leave the module open. And then maybe after you get those adjustments, you just leave it open and you never move forward. It has been known in the past to cause problems and errors in the software if you have that open too long. So usually it's only recommended to have the current year that you're in and then the prior year open. So we're right now in 2015, so you might still be open back into 2014. But as we're getting to the end of 2015, you should really make sure that you get your 2014 closed because when you do those month-end closings or year-end closings, that's when it actually rolls forward the balances in accounts. It's when it calculates your retained earnings. So if you're not doing those, we've seen it start not calculating those properly, and it can really cause a lot of out-of-balance situations in your general ledger. If you are in a situation where you have closed a period already, but perhaps you then get more information from your CPA and you find out you need to make an adjustment to one of those periods that you've already closed, you can come in here to the general ledger options, and then you can change the period back to period 12 of the prior year or whatever period you might need to. You would tell it accept, then you would go make whatever journal entries that you need. But then when you're done, you need to be sure that you don't come back in here and just move it forward again. Because like I said, when we do month and year end, that's when it rolls forward balances. So you'd actually go to period end and do the period end processing 1 month at a time for each of the months to close itself back forward to whatever the month is that you want to be set as current. And the other good thing about closing the modules each month, and some clients definitely do this, is it prevents people from accidentally posting back into one of those closed periods. So even if you think you might be waiting on year-end adjustments from your CPA. You might close the modules just to prevent people from accidentally making a mistake, and then you can just, like I described, reopen it once you do receive those adjustments. And for reports that you should print at the end of the period, that's the trial balance report, your general ledger detail report, and then your standard financial reports. So that's it for your standard month-end or year-end closing procedures for the modules. Now we're going to go through and talk and look closely at how you print your W-2s and 1099s through Atrix. The first thing you want to do is, Atrix is a third-party program or third-party company that partners with Sage. So they provide the software that integrates with Sage 100, that updates the forms for Sage and can print all of these reports. But because it is a separate software, it needs to be installed on each workstation that's going to use that and is going to print these reports. Now it's a pretty simple process to install. Basically, on any workstation that it's needed, you would go and browse out to your Mass90 folder on your server, and inside of your Mass90 folder you have a WK setup folder. Inside of your WK setup folder you'll have an autorun.exe. So what you would want to do is right click on that and tell it to run as administrator. And if you have any trouble installing it, it may be that the user you're working under doesn't have sufficient rights. So you may need to work with your IT and have your IT log in with a domain admin so that you can then have more rights as you're doing the installation. So we'll tell it to run as administrator. And then from this first menu here, the second option down is install the federal and state e-filing and reporting. And then from there's not really any setup questions you have to answer. It's basically just hitting next several times, and then it'll install on the workstation. So if you ever try to launch the 1099 printing or the federal e-filing area and payroll, and you get messages saying that it's not installed, this is where you would come to get that installed for you. So let's jump into payroll, into period end, federal e-filing and reporting. The other thing to point out about this is that you have to be on a current release of the software. If you're not on a new enough version, it's not going to be supported and you won't have access to using the federal e-filing. And you also have to be current on your maintenance with Sage for you to have rights to get those updates and things like that. When you go and launch a report, really any report, your system will then communicate with Atrix's servers and check to see if there's any updated forms. And it will actually check for any federal forms or any state forms, and it checks all of the states. So even if you only do business in one state, it's going to check all of the states. And because it's checking so many different places, invariably you will end up having an update. So don't be surprised if almost every single time you come in here and you try to run a report, it's telling you that you have to do an update. And basically after you've selected your report and hit accept, a window will pop up telling you that there's an update. And the first option on that window is to do an automatic update. So you'll want to click that and let it download and install the updates. And again, if you have trouble installing those updates, it's usually related to your network security. So you can have your IT guy log into your computer, let yourself go ahead and run the update, and then you can log back in as yourself and finish your work. So for our purposes, we're going to come down here and pick the W-2 printing, and you'll see that it still says 2014. Basically, they haven't put out the new forms yet. They'll do that when it gets closer to the end of the month. But from here, you can pick what year you're reporting off of. You can set all of your company information, and this information defaults in from your company maintenance. But obviously, you can come in here and change anything. So if you're printing from your year-end backup company, you can come in here and fix the company name so that it doesn't say year-end backup. Once you have everything selected here, though, you can hit the Accept button. So it's going through and compiling information, checking for any updates, that kind of stuff. I've run it previously on this company, so it's giving me the option to reprint the work that I've done before. But for our purposes, I'm going to start over and start from scratch. So before it gets to the actual W-2 printing, it walks you through this wizard that's going to ask you quite a few questions about your company and your setups and the way you report your taxes, different things like that. Probably for at least 95% of the companies, the answers that it defaults to are the correct answers, but at least the first time you go and run it, you should look at them closely and make sure that they really do apply to you correctly. So it gives us the option of just running a test drive where we can run it with just a few employees. In case you have, thousands of employees, this will let you get a feel for it without taking as long. Or you can test drive with all your employees. We're going to go straight to processing, though, so we'll tell it no thanks. It lets you verify here what your federal ID number is. Gives you another opportunity to put in your company information and also here your contact information. So in case there's any problems with W-2s, the government can reach out to you by email or whatever you have filled in here. So what kind of tax preparer are you? Are you filing for your own company or you're a third party filing for others? So most people are filing for themselves. It verifies and shows you what your state tax IDs are. So do you have any employees that are exempt from any part of Medicare or Social Security? Do you have any employees who earn Social Security tips? Employees with foreign addresses? Do you want to use control numbers on your W-2s? Or do you have employees who elect to receive W-2s electronically? So we'll leave all of those at no. Here we have W-3 information. So if there's a control number you want to go in box A, you can type it there. Choose what kind of payer you are. Most people are 941s. What kind of employer? Again, if you have a third-party sick pay, you can turn that on and fill that in. If you have an establishment number or another EIN number, you can put those in. Or was your business terminated this year? So do you have multiple payrolls for this EIN, or is this all coming from this one company? So once we've answered all of those questions, it's going to take us to this screen here, and this is going to show us all of the employee information, like their name, address, Social Security number, that kind of stuff on the left here, and then the dollar amounts to go in the different boxes, those are over here on the right. You can click on any of these fields and edit or make corrections. So if you found that there were problems as you were researching and verifying your totals, you can come here and fix those amounts on the W-2s. But basically, you're going to come up here and tell it that you want to go to the next step once you're comfortable and you think you have everything good. So each time we click next step, it's going to do some validation, checking things. So like here, it's found that there's a problem with one of my employees' Social Security numbers. So we have somebody who their first number in their Social Security is a 9. No Social Security numbers start with the number 9, so we know that's a problem. So we can tell it to go back and correct, and it'll take us to that cell. And basically, I just made a data entry mistake, and it shouldn't have been a 9, it should have been an 8. So I can make that correction here. Obviously, since this is coming from your employee file, you would want to go back to that employee and correct it there as well. Otherwise, you'll get these errors every time you process your W-2s each year. But then once we've made that fix, we can hit next. Now it's found that there's an employee address line 1 that's blank. So we have a person that we don't have their address. Obviously, we need their address. So we're going to go back and correct. And you can come in here and put in their address. And then you can tell it next again. So now it's done verifying their employee information. Now it's coming through and looking at their state wages. So on these steps, it's mostly requesting for you to look them over and make sure everything looks correct. So look at your Wisconsin wages for these people here. And then once we've verified all of the wages, then it takes us to this screen here where we can choose our options for printing or paying Atrix to file for us. So Atrix is partnering with Sage. It gives you the ability to print these forms for free if you want to print them onto plain paper, or if you want, you can pay Atrix and they will print and electronically file the forms for you. So if you have more than 250 employees, this is the way that you have to electronically file your information. And more, I'm recommending to my clients I really like this complete W-2 filing service because really you only run W-2s once a year. Most of my clients aren't comfortable with it. It's been a year since they've done it and they don't really remember very well. So this can remove a really large headache for you at the end of the year and relieve a lot of that stress from you. So basically all you have to do is verify the totals. If you do this complete service, they'll print the W-2s for you, they'll mail them to your employees for you, and they'll e-file them with the government for you. So really takes care of the full process. And I don't know if these prices are going to change or if these are the 2014 prices, but here at $1.95 per employee, if you go and look at the prices or amount it costs to buy the forms and then for your employees' time to go through and print them all and stuff the envelopes and all that kind of stuff, most of the time it's pretty close to this $1.95. So you're really not spending that much more than you already would be spending, and then you also have the benefit of removing that hassle. But if you're not going that route, you come down here to your other options. So you can tell it to print your employee's W-2. You can tell it, you can choose just to have them e-file for you. Let's say you're over 250, but you're going to print your own and just have them e-file. You can do that. And then choose whether you're going to print your federal and state copies, all of that stuff. I'm going to choose to just print my employees' copies just for demonstration purposes today. Normally, obviously, you'd pick all the appropriate options. So after we tell it next, since obviously this is the way they make their money, they're going to try one more time to get you to do their complete filing service. But we can tell it next again to move past it. And you can click on these links here to go to their website and learn more about it if you want just a little more information. This option here for divider sheets, if you're printing the different forms, your employee copy, the federal and state copy, and your employer copy, do you want a divider sheet to print in between each of those so you can more easily separate them and find them as you're looking through the stack? So I'm going to tell that no. And then it just gives us a review here of what we've chosen to print. So we have our W-2 copies, and then we have the W-2 notice for the employees. Now once we go through that, it loads the information. You'll see it shows kind of on the screen here what you're looking for or what it's going to look like when you go to print it. One of the reasons these forms line up so well is because it actually prints the lines and boxes and labels for you. So there's none of that trying to adjust and inch things up and down and all that. It's all going to line up. So when you're ready, you hit the print final, and it's going to tell you what you need to put in. So you'll want to insert your 4-part perforated W-2 paper. So this doesn't use the standard paper that you would just go down to your office supply store and buy. It uses paper that is blank on the front and is just perforated into the 4-part sections. That's how it can print all the lines and boxes and still line up and look really good. So Sage does sell that. Let me jump over and show you that. So this website here, if you go to sagechecks.com, then you'd be able to come down and select tax forms and look at W-2s or 1099s. For your W-2s, they have a couple different options. They have a blank version, which is blank on the front and blank on the back, meaning that it doesn't have the employee instructions printed on the back. So you would have to print those separately and fold them up and put them in your envelope. Or it has them with the employee instructions, and it has them with the envelopes that go with them. So you would go through and look at which ones of those you would want it. And similarly, they have 1099 options, because 1099s basically work the same with the 4-part perforated blank sheets. So here I'm going to tell it OK, because I've gone and put that stock in there. If this is your first time using the federal e-filing or Atrix printing for the printer that you're going to send them to, then you would go ahead and do this page alignment. If you've already done this in the past, it will remember, or done this in the past from this computer, it will remember your settings. But basically, it does still obviously have to be at a specific location on the page, but each printer might pull paper out of its tray slightly differently. So things might be a little further to the left or right, up or down. So this helps you take care of that and adjust the printing so that it lines up with what the government is expecting. So you would print your alignment form, which is basically a list of instructions for you. It's basically going to have you then print the test page, and you're going to get out a ruler and measure how far from the side specific marks that it prints on the test page are. And then if the marks aren't in the right location, then you would come in here with these rulers or with the amounts down here, and you would adjust and print your test page again until you get it all lined up. But then once you have this set, it's set for all of the printing that you'll do through Atrix. Okay, and at this point, basically you would go and just print your documents, and once you're done with each form, then you'd tell it next step, and it would move on to your next form. So we're not going to go through all of those because it's basically just printing. So as we come through and close out of here, obviously if you have a large number of employees, you may not have enough time to sit down and research and deal with all of the information in one sitting. So it gives you the ability to save your information as a work in process so that you can access it at another time. So as you close out, it lets you tell it yes that you want to save, and then the next time you come in, it'll take you directly to this screen and let you finish off making any adjustments that you need to the employees. For our purposes here, I'm just going to tell it no, though. And then we will go and take a look at 1099 printing. So that's in Accounts Payable under the Reports folder and Form 1099 e-filing and reporting. So you'll find that it's very similar to what we just looked at with the W-2. And really, most of the reports that you would print through the e-filing areas, they're very similar. So once you get comfortable with one of them, you should have a pretty easy time with the rest of them as well. But you can come up here, tell it that you're going to do a new, so you're doing new printing, you're not continuing on with something you've done before. Choose what form type you want. I'm going to pick miscellaneous. Then I'm going to put in my $600 year-to-date minimum payment. And then I'm going to accept. For here, I am just printing 2014 information because we don't really have the next year's forms yet, and it really doesn't affect the process either way. Just like the last one, it walks you through a wizard that's going to ask you several questions. Again, most of the correct responses for clients are the default answers they're set to. So we're not going to test. We're going to move straight into processing. Verifies your employer ID number. Gives you an opportunity to set your payer information. Are you filing for your own company or your third party? So I'm filing for myself. Lets you verify any state tax numbers. Do you have recipients who elected to receive electronically? Or is this your final return? So we'll tell that no as well. Options for how you want your recipient identification numbers so no truncation, so it's going to print the full Social Security number, and yes to print zeros. And then we're using a single 1099 data for this EIN. And then you'll see it looks very similar to how the W-2s looked. Over on the left, we have the vendor information. And on the right, we have the information from the 1099s. If we hit next, it goes through and does validation. And then you're supposed to come over and verify the income boxes. Again, here it has an option for you to have Atrix do the printing for you and mail all the documents for you. So again, if you don't have many people, if you have less than 25 employees, it doesn't necessarily cost you that much. So a lot of people I'm finding are choosing to go this direction. But for our purposes here, we're going to pick the other options. And then we'll print the recipient copies. We'll skip past this option. We'll tell it no for divider sheets. So it's going to print the recipient copy and their instructions. And again, it shows you kind of like the W-2s, shows you what it's going to look like. You can look that over here if you're coming in here and just testing things to verify the totals and part of your reconciliation. You can just look at these. Again, when you're ready, you can print, and it tells you to put in the 4-part perforated 1099 paper. And that's basically all there is for printing those. And then when it's done, it's going to ask you if you want to increment the default 1099 calendar year. If you're not done printing your if you're not done printing your 1099s for the year, definitely tell this no. And at any time, you can go into the accounts payable options if you did accidentally tell it yes, and you could switch the default 1099 year back to what it was before. So I'm going to tell it no. So that's 1099s and W-2s. You'll see they were very similar processes. I want to show you one other report from payroll. I'm going to show you the 941 form, because it looks a little different than that grid entry where you're selecting each employee and changing the amounts. So this is the other way that you may see forms. Basically, it takes you straight into what the form is going to look like. Any of these blue boxes you can click on and edit the information. You can hover over any of these fields and they give you help and information about what data goes in there. And it highlights in red any amounts that you need to enter before you can actually print the document. So now that I've put in a dollar amount there, it switches. So if we try to hit next before it's done, it's going to move me up. So basically you would go through like that, move through, fill in all of the red boxes, make sure all the dollar amounts are correct. If there's any issues, you would click on those fields and override those amounts. One last thing to point out about when you're processing your W-2s, if you found that there was inconsistent data for the employees, so the amounts weren't correct for one of their W-2s, if you edit those numbers in that grid where it listed all the employees in Matrix, those changes that you make there in that grid, they are not going to change the information that's in Sage if you go and look up that employee. So you would need to also make those changes under the employee if you wanted to keep those two matching with each other. And the last thing to point out is where you can get some more information. If you have year-end questions, you can go to the customer portal on Sage's website. You can log in with that and go to the knowledge base and, search for questions and go to their year-end center and get information and frequently asked questions there. You can also come to Sage City. That is Sage's, it's basically like a discussion forum for partners and clients to talk about the products, to ask questions of each other, and it's, a community-based, and people can answer your questions and that kind of stuff. So they have a specific area, sagecity.na.sage.com/p/year-end. And then once you come to that website, you can select Sage 100. And this base website, this first website here, has good information over here about the important dates for when your filing is due, and also links to different government websites where you can get, official information. But for the Sage 100 area, it has sections for your tax table updates, for installation instructions, specific information about payroll and reports and tax forms, and then it has different checklists for you for your payroll and your AP, that sort of stuff. So it's a good place to come if you have questions. Take a look here, see if you can get answers to those questions. Obviously, if you can't, reach out to us and we can help you with anything that may come up. So that is the end of what we have today. So we'll go through and start doing questions. So on your panel that may have minimized or hid itself on the right side of your screen, if you look for that little bar and click the arrow, you can expand it, and there's a chat or a question section where you can type in a question for us. So go ahead and start entering in any questions that you have, and I'll go through and start answering questions for what we already have, and yeah, we'll go through and answer all of them. So we have a question from Lisa about if you change the length of SO history to save, can you find history elsewhere? I think you're in reference to like the accounts receivable and the history retention for retaining paid invoices. So if you have that set, or if you have it at a lower amount and it starts purging those paid invoices, you can still access that information from the accounts receivable invoice history report, or you can come into an invoice history inquiry obviously in AR, AP, whatever module it may apply to, and you can do a lookup here, and this has your full history as well. So you can go back and find any information there. So Bob has a question for W-2s and 1099s using Atrix printing and forms bought through Sage Checks. Do we have to use a color printer? No, you would not use a color printer. When you have those 4-part perforated forms, those you would be printing in black and white. And for your W-2s, you would be printing each of those basically just printing them on those perforated forms, or some of the federal ones allow you to print onto just plain paper. For 1099s, there are federal copies that have to be printed in red, and when you buy your forms, it actually will include those red copies as well. So when you print those ones, it won't be printing the boxes. It will just be printing the data that goes into the boxes. So another important reason that you go through and do the alignment. But yeah, you'll then have that red copy for you. Kenneth is asking, do we have a step-by-step procedure for the purchases clearing report update? I don't have a step-by-step for that. I can check with some of the other consultants, see if they know of anything like that. But basically it just involves going in and taking a look, printing that purchases clearing report, looking at that report total, and then going back to your general ledger, checking to see what the balance is in your purchases clearing GL account, and if there are any discrepancies or they're not matching, then you would be going and you would be comparing the transactions and the postings to that GL account to find out where the differences are. That can be somebody's done a journal entry and posted it against the purchases clearing. That can be that somebody has coded one of the expense lines in an AP invoice or a purchase order or something to that purchases clearing GL, something like that. So I hope that answers your questions. We have a follow-up to Lisa's question about the history. Does the number of years to retain history work the same as number of years? So if you have your history set for 3 years back, what is that going to do? So yes, if you have your history set for 3 years, it's going to keep that history for 3 years. And each month as you're closing your modules, if you have history that's older than that, it's going to be clearing that information. Now I don't think Sage has documentation for the specific areas that each of those areas cover. You know, this history retention is going to affect these 5 tables, that kind of stuff. That's why in general, I like to recommend if you have the space on your server and you're not processing thousands of invoices every month and you're running out of space, most of the time it's best to just set that to the maximum level, and then you're always left with the maximum amount of history that's available to you. We have a question. Somebody's already purchased their W-2 bundle, their W-2 forms with envelopes. Will these work, or will I have to purchase the blank perforated forms? If you've already purchased W-2 forms and they have all of the lines and boxes and stuff on there, those will not work with printing the Atrix. Printing from the federal e-filing, the Atrix area, it is designed to work with those blank perforated forms. So it prints the labels and the lines and all of that stuff. So you would need to get those and use the blank perforated ones as your forms. I believe that is our last question that we have. So if you have any additional questions, go ahead and start putting.
Uh-oh. Sorry about that. We just had a quick audio blurb glitch. I can start unmuting people if anyone just wants to ask a question, since we don't have too many folks left.
So
and if you don't have a microphone.
So Dennis is asking, does Atrix double check the TIN with the SSA for verification? I don't know if TIN is your tax ID number. What's TIN, Dennis? Your tax identification?
I don't think it does.
I don't think, yeah. It's basically trusting that you're giving it the correct identification numbers, and then basically Atrix is going to submit to the government whatever information you give them. So it's basically up to you to have the correct numbers and identifications that you need. Okay, I'm not seeing any more questions come in. We'll go ahead and hang on here for a few more minutes. If you're having trouble finding the questions area, remember it usually minimizes to the right side of your screen, and you have to push that arrow button to expand it so you can type in your question. So Michael's asking, when will a copy of the session be available to download? We will be sending an email out in the next few days that will have a link for you to download the recording of the session. And if you didn't already download the handout that stepped through the different closing procedures, it will include a link for that as well.
Ryan, I think there might be one more question in chat, and then I think we're close to wrapped up.
So Patty's asking, or saying that her fiscal year is different from the calendar year. Are there any concerns or adjustments that need to be made for 1099 processing? There aren't any changes that you need to make. The system's designed to look at the date of those payments, and it knows that they are based off of a calendar year, so it only looks for those questions. It only looks for those payments within a calendar date range. So it does that automatically for you. You don't have to make any kind of changes or adjustments to what you're doing. So Kenneth is asking, how would you remove an entry from the purchases clearing report? So if you have something showing up on there that doesn't belong, usually that means that you received those goods on a purchase order, but you didn't do a receipt of invoice against that purchase order, because that's what normally clears it off. Maybe you manually did an AP invoice or something like that. So the two ways you can get it removed off of there would be to do the receipt of invoice that wasn't done, and that will then cause it to drop off, and that may require you to reverse the incorrect AP invoice, or maybe it was never supposed to be received, and that's why you haven't received an invoice for it. So then you could do a return of goods to basically unreceive those goods, and that would also make it drop off of the purchases clearing report. So those are the two ways that you would do that.
Okay, I think that's a wrap unless anybody else has one quick final question. If you want to use the raise your hand option, I can find you that way. And I don't see anything, so I think that is a wrap for today.
Thank you, everybody, for coming out.
Thanks for joining us.